Hi, this is Dan Sullivan. I'd like to welcome you to the Multiplier Mindset Podcast. When I was going through grade school in the 1950s, my father was a full-time farmer during the summertime, but during the wintertime, he worked at a trucking company. The town that we were closest to was called Norwalk, the big town. There were small towns around, but this was the bigger town, and when I talk about a big town, back then it was around 10,000 population. Norwalk Truck Line is a very interesting firm. It was one of the real pioneering trucking lines in the eastern part of the United States where most of the population was. And I believe in the mid-1950s, it was the second largest truck line in the United States. And it all came out of this little town in northern Ohio, but then there were depots and terminals for the truck line all over the eastern United States, all the way to St. Louis, if I understand, but the big cities, Chicago, Detroit, and then Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, probably that area, if you can imagine it on a map, that was the area. And this truck line had hundreds of trucks and drivers. And my father was a dock foreman for part of the day, and his shift started probably around 10 in the morning and ended at around 6 o'clock at night. So one of my after school activities, school got out at 3 o'clock, as I'd walk down, and you have to imagine how things have changed in the world. And as a 8 or 9-year-old boy out of school, I could walk the docks. There was heavy machinery around. There were lifts and there was heavy things going on, and I'd go through the machine shops and all the different parts that were involved in maintaining and trucks and everything involved with the mechanics, the upkeep, machine shops and everything like that. It was this extra world that I knew about that nobody else knew about. None of the other siblings in my family really ever did this. Classmates, no other students actually did this, and I had this secret world that I would go down to, and I especially liked going into the dispatch office where all the orders for the trucks, where they were going, what they were carrying, what their schedule was, and that was all on a huge map. And it was interesting because I just kind of immersed myself that I was in touch with half the United States. Every night I would go down and I would ask what trucks are going where and what are they carrying. And it just took my mind and took it outside my local circumstances. I knew about this much bigger world of the trucking line network. And I just found it fascinating. I found it as fascinating, more so than any of the topics that I was taking in school, because I could walk out and see this truck, and this truck was going to Pittsburgh, and then this truck was going to Boston, and I could imagine all along the way. And then I would go to the encyclopedia and I would learn about those cities. So it was a tremendous geography lesson. It was kind of an economics lesson. I would walk around every day. I made my rounds. I would go around to the various parts of the entire complex, and I'd say hello to this person and hello to that person. And all this was happening without any knowledge on the part of any of the other students at school. My sister and my brothers didn't know anything about this. My father knew about it, but he didn't pay any attention. He says, stay out of the way. He says, don't get into trouble. Me, get into trouble? I never got into trouble because I didn't want to lose my access to this world. So one of the things I've discovered about this, and it's probably in all the stories about my childhood and my growing up that I'm telling in this historical series, is that I had this ability to turn almost anything that I encountered since I was very young into a very interesting learning experience, especially when it came to organization and structure and process. If you think about the hundreds of trucks and the thousands of shipments and the 20 or so cities, there was a wonderful kind of complexity, but it all made sense. It was all a system. And I developed a lot of my love of structure and process from these childhood experiences where real things were happening in the world. And I kind of understood how these real things in the real world, and it all involved enormous work. Everybody was working. So it's a marvelous part of my childhood. And as I'm telling you this story, I can see myself very clearly back in that, on the docks and in the machine shops and the dispatch office in the mid-1950s. I think the biggest thing I learned from that is that the entire world, what makes the world go around is that someone invented an interesting structure and system for getting work done, and that it's very, very important to understand that nothing in the world actually happens unless there's organized work, that there's organized structure, that there's organized cooperation, there's selling, there's buying. The biggest thing I learned is that you could take that Norwalk truck line experience that I had when I was in grade school, and that you could multiply this by millions and millions of times every day, and that's kind of how the world works. So I have this enormous appreciation of the vast systems of competition and cooperation that every day is allowing the conveniences that we have, the comforts that we have, the new capabilities that we acquire. All this has very, very organized structures and processes of work underneath. I think that the biggest question that I would ask all the entrepreneurs, especially those of you who have ambitions of getting bigger, have you thought through the structures of cooperation, teamwork, and creation of value that actually are going to be necessary for you to achieve your goals? Because if your goal is to have greater revenues and profits and everything that your increased economic success can buy, do you have an understanding of the increased structure and processes of cooperation with other people? Do you have a real concept of the increased capabilities you're going to have to achieve those goals that are going to give you the greater revenue and profits?